Hi, and welcome to this episode of Thoughts and Inclinations. I'm your host, Johnny. My guest for this episode is Mr. Julian Vayne. Julian, amongst many things, is the author of numerous books and essays revolving around the psychedelic sphere and esoteric culture. He's also an occultist whose name is most closely associated with chaos magic, which is fascinating, and he unpacks that for us a little later in the podcast. Outside of that, Julian also works as an entheogenic practitioner. He is working with various medicines and techniques to craft ceremonial spaces so that the participants can gain the most insight, meaning, and authenticity from the psychedelic experience. And this is really what I wanted to pick his brain on over the course of this episode. And I was lucky enough to receive a copy of one of his books and larger projects to note, Getting Higher, the Manual of Psychedelic Ceremony. So I really want to put a shout out and a big thank you to the Psychedelic Press UK for my copy of Julian's book and the opportunity to connect with him for this conversation. Now, one of the areas that I'm particularly interested in, and just for the general show and the direction of this podcast, is how psychedelics and plant medicines are making a huge impact in the field of science and mental health. And this is a topic that is quite close to my heart, and we discuss this at some length. And that involves us discussing the current mental health crisis in Western society, and unfortunately the horribly high rates of suicide, particularly amongst young people. So this might be a sensitive topic to many people, and I really appreciate that. So I just wanted to give a little heads up that this is something that we do talk about at length in the second half of the podcast. However, we talk about a great many things, really. We also discuss history, culture, and the importance of both when crafting a ceremony. Furthermore, we also go on to discuss the notions of trauma and what role that might play in generational health. So anyone who is familiar with the work of Dr. Gabor Mate, for example, will probably be quite familiar with this concept. And finally, one thing before we get on with the episode, Julian is speaking at the Occulture conference here in Berlin next week, and his topic is on drugs in modern occulture. And his slot, I believe, is on Sunday at 3:30 p.m. You can find tickets online for the conference at occultureberlin.org, and it's running from November 16th to the 18th. And I'll leave a link to the website for tickets if anyone's interested. The weekend of Occulture promises over 30 hours of curated events, I think, with more than 50 speakers and artists. It should include loads of lectures and workshops and live music, and I believe there's food and drinks and all sorts, so it's totally worth checking out. That is the Berlin Occulture Conference. Oh, and one more thing, for anybody interested in finding out more about Julian and his works, you can seek that information on his website, and that is at the blog of Baphomet.com. Blog of Baphomet. Once again, I'll put that in the podcast notes and leave links to the site and also the tickets for Occulture. So I'll leave you now with the episode and Julian Vayne, and just to say that Julian has a basin of knowledge across a great many topics, and he's really razor sharp, both in his delivery and in the way he speaks. And just a big thank you to anyone who's listening or tuning in, and a big thank you to Julian, of course. Enjoy. P.S. The interview was conducted over Skype, so the audio won't be quite as clear as this microphone I'm communicating with you on now, but it is more than audible and should be clear. Perfect. Hi. Hey. Thanks.
Hey.
Thanks for doing this. I've been pretty excited. So
you're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me to do the podcast thing.
Yeah, no, really, it's cool. So I have a few notes here, Julian, because I know we didn't really get to connect much to talk about how we might make this episode flow. Mm-hmm. And so if I hit you with my points, and you can tell me if you think that makes a safe episode, right? Okay. So I thought we'd begin with obviously a little bit about your book, Getting Higher. Mm-hmm. And then we'd move into a little bit about this current renaissance we have around entheogenics. And one of the entheogenics I'm pretty interested in, although I haven't heard you speak that openly about, is this element of science meeting spirituality kind of breaking away from religion, and the kind of what entheogenics might bring to the current mental health crisis. Now, I don't want to draw you into too much of that, of course I don't, but I would love to at the end of the podcast get your 5 cents on it, if that's totally okay.
Yeah, and then contribute to that. That's a really good set. Yeah.
And then I thought we would end on your chat next week at the Occulture conference here in Berlin. Mm-hmm. And I'll get you to unpack your sort of knowledge around what is meant by magic, define that for us, esotericism, and how you got into all that.
Okay.
And,
cool. See how it flows. Yeah, sounds good.
Cool. And also I'll record an intro about you after this episode, using the bits I found on the internet rather than making you do this now. So, Getting Higher, a Manual of Psychedelic Ceremony. How does this come to be, Julian? This is your latest book as well, right?
Not quite. I've had one subsequent to that, which is Walking Backwards, or the Magical Art of Psychedelic Psychogeography, with my good friend Greg Humphreys. So that's again a psychedelic book, but Getting Higher has been the really big project that I've been working on for several years. It's basically, I guess, a book which is partly what I wanted to see out there, and it's my imperfect attempt to share the knowledge that I've acquired and that other people have, good teachers have given me, about ways of enhancing and holding and directing the psychedelic experience for the purposes of, healing, self-discovery, transformation, things that we might describe as magic, all kinds of things. So it's like it's a manual technique. It's a list of different techniques with different material in there to kind of flesh those out with a couple of stories of my own, just as not for people to emulate, but just like, hey, this is my experience of this, and this is what I did in this context. So it goes from really kind of quite complete entheogenic ceremony stuff through to very straightforward kind of mind hacks, you could call them, I guess you could do when you're high.
Mm-hmm.
That's the idea.
Cool. So the book arrived in my hands yesterday, so I didn't have the chance. Yeah, so I wanted to get it before when I went away, so I could get into it. So I know a little bit about it though from your previous chats and your writings online. Essentially, you're creating the ceremonial space, but you do it with sort of your knowledge around like contextualizing from historical culture as well. Is there some?
Man, it comes from all different sources. So my own background is I'm born into late 20th century kind of culture in England as like a working class white guy who's fascinated by magic but has no cultural reference points to this. Yeah, so I haven't got any kind of lineage or anything like this. So I find myself in various traditions. I find my way into Wicca, into witchcraft, which is the neo-pagan witchcraft of the latter part of the 20th century, and kind of get into that. And I get into chaos magic. And so Getting Higher is a book which kind of draws on that as my tradition. My tradition is the magpie tradition of finding things that work or coming across great teachers, some of whom are part of lineages. So I've worked with kind of, people from the Native American Church and syncretic kind of ayahuasca using groups and more kind of traditional shamanic style stuff, and ritual communities and various other people. So those people are an influence on me, but that's not where I'm coming from. I'm also coming from a tradition that's informed by punk, that's informed just by Discordianism, that's informed by the idea of like neuro hacking, that's informed by the kind of emerging science we've got in the psychedelic renaissance. So that's just, and that's not like that's the way you should be. That's just like my story. Yeah. So the book arises in that way. So the ceremonies that I talk about, sometimes I say, okay, this is the Native American Church style way of doing it, and the core elements as I understand them from my experience are these. But you can mix this up for your affinity group, and you can work this in the way that makes sense to you. If you're going to use a set of symbols or iconography in your psychedelic ceremony, it's got to make sense to the people involved. Yeah. And so if that's something taken from contemporary culture, if that's taken from like the latest Netflix thing that you're all really inspired by,
Yeah.
then fine. Yeah, that's okay. Someone's got to make deities, and ideas have to be manufactured by humans. Tradition is a work in progress, not a thing that we should just copy from the past slavishly.
Okay.
So my story is that, basically, Johnny. That's where I'm coming from on this.
And so essentially, if we were to talk about, say, an ayahuasca ceremony, Julian, it would say that maybe like I don't know, Icaros and tobacco culture maybe isn't really relevant to the experiencer.
I don't know. I mean, I think that you have to look at the kind of the history and the context. So ayahuasca is a particular combination. It comes from a particular cultural setting. Taking aside all the kind of, for the moment, the kind of political and sort of ethical issues associated with its use and its proliferation. This medicine will have come to you almost certainly from the Amazon. Even if you've actually boiled the ingredients together, they will have come from the Amazon. So there's a story there and there's a relationship there. So you probably want to engage with that. Yeah. How you choose to do that, there are lots of different ways of having an ayahuasca ceremony. You can have the Santo Daime style where you stand up and you have a Portuguese hymn book and you sing all night, and that's cool. Or you can have a set style of a ceremony like the ones that Michael Hahn talks about in hallucinogenics and shamanism, where he talks about just like, taking the brew and then being there sleeping in the hammock, and that's basically the deal. And you go totally inward and you do it that way. And lots of groups use it in different ways. So the way the medicine comes to you, you think about what that was, what was that story? Yeah, who gave it to me? How does that come? How does that arrive? What narrative is inside this medicine? And then what stuff is around me that makes sense to me as a psychedelic adventurer who finds themselves in the fortunate position to have this medicine, maybe with a group of friends, maybe on their own.
Okay.
And there's lots of different ways of meeting that. There isn't, I guess my big call in Getting Higher and other work is about, we can have multiplicity, and we also should have lots and lots of kind of critical questioning about these things as well. That's really important. And of course, to find our own way, I find our authentic way as individuals and communities.
Yeah. I guess that's that whole. I'm sure you're familiar with Graham Hancock, who used to say, if you really want the most out of this, you're probably better off going down to the jungle and experiencing that culturally.
Yeah, I mean, I would. I have yet to have the opportunity to go and take ayahuasca in an Amazonian setting,
Okay.
and I've lots of friends who've done so. Some of who have got like really, uh, have had really kind of deep engagements with the medicine in Europe, and have then gone there. Other friends who've kind of gone there and had the experience for the first time and come back and blah blah. So it's not a sort of a judgment thing, but I think it does make sense that if you want to connect with that that substance and the experiences that can give you, having a relationship with the place from which it comes is really important. And that may be a relationship with a person. It's kind of nice I mean, sure, if you're able to go there and so on, that's cool. Having said that, and appreciating where Graham's coming from, I think that the other thing to think about is when you go somewhere, you make a massive impact on that culture and that setting. You don't travel there without any kind of effect on the people that you meet, as well as they being an influence on you. And so, the whole issue of ayahuasca tourism, ayahuasca pilgrimage, depending on how you want to frame this stuff, is important as well. So you may choose to actually buy the materials necessary to make ayahuasca, or come up with a variant of the same chemistry and use that, and not go to that place, because you know that you going isn't going to be a big deal, but 100,000 people going every month is. Yeah. And so maybe your relationship is to kind of go, no, I'm not going to do that. Or the other relationship you might decide is you might say, okay, well, ayahuasca and mushrooms are basically within a hair's breadth of each other, the same thing pharmacologically.
Okay.
And I argue, in terms of the way that they work, I'm not going to bother with the ayahuasca. I'm just going to grow my own shrooms.
Yeah.
Yeah, do it that way.
Yeah. That's
But,
that was almost kind of my accidental journey into all of this stuff, Julian, was that I maybe 4 or 5 years ago happened across DMT and ayahuasca, and was only profoundly excited by it, but only literally. And then a few years later, the sort of passing of my mother sort of triggered me to explore this more. But obviously, ayahuasca is typically $2,000 away if you want to do it in the Peruvian sense. And then before that, I would never have thought about psilocybin or psilocin. And it was kind of weird how that moment kind of came into play with people who are hosting ceremonies around that. So yeah. So essentially, you would kind of feel that ayahuasca tourism is quite a damaging thing, prospectively, to these
I
cultures.
think I mean, it's going to vary. It's going to vary given all those details, but it will certainly have a significant impact. Of course, the other side of it is that this is not equally. The people in South America are not. They too are agents with autonomy and action, and they have effects on the rest of the world as well. It's not just a one-way street. But I think that we can look at. If you take the story of Maria Sabina, and you take the story of how she, peace be upon her, this beautiful woman who reminds Western culture, Euro-American culture,
Mhm.
of there's a magical medicine in the mushrooms, and actually, amusingly, it grows in our own backyard and
Yeah.
on the wood chip and on the moorland and all, yeah. And if you look at her story, she had a difficult time of it, when Gordon Wasson went ahead and published the article, which isn't really what she wanted, and identified her directly. She had a whole bunch of people turning up in her yard, and it all became quite tricky. Towards the end of her life, she really wasn't very happy how it worked out. Now, that's like a microcosm version of what will be being played out in many people's lives. Not everyone by any stretch of the imagination, because there'll be Peruvian guys who are coming over to Europe, having a fantastic time doing really good-hearted work with people, setting up relationships in South America, and it'll be fine. Yeah, there'll be times when that's cool. But just have to be really thoughtful about it, I think. Just have to be really thoughtful about it. And, usual drill, listen to your heart, ask good critical friends to give their opinion, and do that.
Sure, sure. That makes a lot of sense. So, Julian, you offer ceremonial help, obviously. And do you do this in the UK without probing too many questions? And if so, what are the kind of substances that are typically used?
Well, obviously in the UK, all my work involves not using any substances that I'm not currently licensed to use. Bear in mind, of course, there are no illegal drugs. There's only people who are unlicensed to use them.
Okay.
So I would say that most of the time, the work I do in Britain tends to be deliberately not using psychedelic medicines. So, and the reason for that, apart from the whole legal thing, is that, man, you can go and buy this stuff. That's fine, whatever. What I'm interested in sharing with people technique about like ceremony and other processes that you could put in to this environment, where you could have some other psychedelic method of changing consciousness, breath work or ecstatic dance or whatever. And if those people want to take that away and use that in a psychedelic context, that makes total sense. So, for example, I recently, myself and my partner, we did a ceremony in London, which was a mushroom ceremony. And the mushroom ceremony, we had to say to the people, look, we all know, friends, here we are gathered in the time of oppression where the mushrooms I'm going to give you are porcini and oyster and shiitake, because I cannot give you, and we cannot come together and share psychedelic mushrooms,
Sure.
But what we can do is we can do this ritual, and we can use breath work, and we can use chanting to get into this altered state, and we can do this collectively. And people who've never been to a psychedelic ceremony can see that unfold and go, oh, I see how you do this. They can then take that idea home, and they can find the mushrooms, and they can sort it out with their friends using the symbol set and an approach that works for them. So mostly what Nikki and I do is we teach those sorts of techniques in settings, of course, where it's legal to do so. I do use psychedelic medicines, and those are primarily, I say primarily, there's a whole bunch actually, because again, being from this kind of chaos magic tradition, I haven't got a traditional medicine with the arguable exception of the mushrooms that grow in the land that I live in. So I'll use, again, allowing for the law, mushrooms and cannabis and MDMA and 5-MeO-DMT and, a whole bunch of peyote and, ayahuasca and various other things, tobacco, all of these things, because I have over time been fortunate to develop a relationship with those things, to be, to some degree familiar with them, and working with other people within those altered states. But also using, this is one of the things, and one of the things I'm going to talk about at occulture at this conference in Berlin, which is that one of the things I'm interested in is actually how we, how occultists, how magicians, how practitioners, how shamans who aren't allowed to call themselves shamans because they're not shamans, as it were, people like me, we get to work with a whole bunch of new spirits that come into culture. How do you do a ritual which holds the experience of ketamine for a group of people?
Sure.
It's a very valuable medicine. Yeah, it has it, like all of them. It has its challenging side, and its associations that can be difficult for people, but it can undoubtedly be very helpful. So how do we make healing spaces, which we're just starting to do now in terms of conventional medicine, for the ketamine experience? And can we do ceremonies in the same way that you would do a peyote ceremony, or not the same way, but with the same aspiration of kind of coming together through a group and collective experience with something like ketamine? The answer to which, incidentally, is yes, you can. So there's a whole bunch of stuff like that occultists, magicians, people in the West can do. And we've done this before. We did it with acid. When acid came into our culture, we figured out ways of holding that space. We created a thing called the rock music festival.
Sure. That's an interesting point.
When MDMA came into our culture, we created a thing called the rave, and it had certain structures, it had certain kind of parameters, and it had the same rhythm as the peyote circle.
Sure.
So it's like, yeah, these things come into our culture. How do we respond?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I found it like a very interesting Terence McKenna quote on tribalism and using electronic music as very syncopated. That is the syncopated drum beat that could be associated with perhaps like Tabernacle Ibogaine or something like that. And many times, I mean, I'm living here in Berlin, and I don't know how familiar you are with Berlin, Julian, but it is a city that is built on the foundations of electronic music at its
Oh
heart.
yeah, peace be
And
upon it. I mean, the fabulous city. Yeah,
yeah, and a fairly liberal city, and I'll leave it at that.
yeah.
For many reasons. Julian, you often speak about bringing back the importance of authenticity within the psychedelic ceremony,
Hmm.
and I'm curious if that means to be authentic to the self, to the participant, or authentic to the relationship with that person's required need from the ceremony. And if so, that must be quite a hard thing to do. I'm not sure how many people are in these ceremonies. Maybe that's a compound question.
It's interesting. It's an interesting thing. I mean, I guess both of the above in a way. I suppose I've been involved in styles of magic and styles of ceremony, which are very kind of formalized and where you learn lots of stuff and you memorize vast amounts of technical detail, and some of that is even still in my brain. But my preferred style
Sure.
is to try and be what I just described, because I haven't got many better words than this, kind of authentic in the moment. So when you're in the ceremony and something is said, you're trying to kind of, I don't know, tune into the people and the time of the moment and try to do the action that is most, in a way, most kind of poetic or most fitting.
Sure.
Yeah, that's where it comes from. So, for example, in a lot of the ceremonies that I do, a thing that I've uh, uh, respectfully gained from some of the Native American kind of settings that I've been in is this idea of prayer. Now, prayer to a card-carrying occultist like me is like a boring, stupid, sissy rubbish thing, because it's like prayer, praying for stuff, whatever. Sounds rubbish, doesn't it? And having been to the Clarity Circle and has seen how it's used, seen how this, to talk as a chaos magician, how this tech is deployed, it's really beneficial. So when I do, it's like, let's imagine that I'm in a place where it's safe and legal to do so, and I'm doing a circle with people with 5-MeO DMT. So what we'll do is we'll go around and we'll take the medicine. We'll do that. We'll kind of safely kind of see everyone back through the process, and then what we'll do is we'll make a round of prayers. And the round of prayers is about kind of putting these. It's about recognizing the things in your life that are good. Yeah, it's about kind of, because our attention is usually called to things that are painful or problematic, and a prayer is an opportunity to call our attention to things that are beneficial and helpful in our lives.
That's interesting.
Yeah, now this is good for us in all kinds of ways. It's good for our immune system, it's good for our self-esteem, it's good for our relationships, therefore, with other people. um, and when we pray, what we try and do is we try and speak authentically. So we're talking to a candle in the middle of the room, or a thing that represents the Great Spirit. It doesn't really matter, the Tao or the goddess or Baphomet, anything. It doesn't really matter. But we're talking to this thing, usually aloud. We're not, even if there's other people in the room, we're not talking to these other guys. We're talking to this thing that represents I don't know, good fortune, or and we're just acknowledging, we're saying, oh, Great Spirit, I want to really acknowledge my beautiful children. I want to really sort of show my thanks about how my body is still good. I'm 50 and I'm walking around and everything's fine. Yeah. Now, in that moment, when I speak, when I say my prayer, and this is what I encourage other people to do, and most people can do it, it's not a problem, is you're speaking authentically. You're just trying to say what needs to be said. Yeah, you're not saying a particular prayer. It's not,
Okay.
our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. This is
Yeah.
like you're speaking in a way that is completely from the heart to this other thing, in order to, and whether you imagine this as like a kind of deeply spiritual process, or you just say this is a mind hack to make my immune system better, I'm not interested in. I'm interested in whether or not you can authentically speak your prayer in this moment. Yeah, and helping people to do that in whatever way I can. That's what I like to do.
And that in turn kind of puts the respect back into the hands of the whatever the substance or symbol might be for the evening.
Yeah. And if you're praying, I mean, it's like a lot of the kind of tech in magic is about a sort of an animism, I guess we would call it, if we found it in a kind of indigenous culture.
Mm.
So we very often, it's about changing your approach to things, often in quite subtle ways. So to treat the drugs you've got in your hand as sacred medicine, yeah. And even if you just even if outside of that, in some sort of like meta cynical moment in the bar, you decide that that's, hey, I'm just convincing myself of that. Yes, you are convincing yourself of that. And in that moment, you have to authentically engage with the idea that this is the sacred medicine brought to us, blah, 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 whatever. And though, so a lot of magic, a lot of the stuff I'm interested in, a lot of the stuff that, getting high is about, and I think I'm guessing a lot of what occultism is going to be about, is about actually quite subtle shifts of perspective and behavior, which allow us to see whole new ways of understanding the world. Because if you haven't, Western people bang on about, oh, wouldn't it be great if we were all like animist and pans and saw spirits all the time, like all those groovy people in either in the past or in somewhere weird and ethnic.
Sure.
Actually, a lot of it is just about subtle but nevertheless powerful shifts of perception, which we as humans can make. Yeah, we as humans can make. And so perceiving the drugs as living spirits, genuinely so, and more than that, listening to what they say to you, in the sense of like, not just talking, but listening to what comes back, being attentive to that. Those are skills that we can get. We can get this. It's an embodied thing in being a human.
So if I was to hypothetically set my mind to have the intention of gratitude, as you spoke about earlier, before a ceremony, I would, for the most part, I would be kind of altered in a way that the benefits I'm trying to receive from that evening would be somewhat orientated to gratitude or things that are more positive. And does that fold back into set and setting?
Yeah, I'm thinking of this rather than necessarily a whole intention for a ceremony,
Okay.
although it would be for that. I'm thinking of a moment of prayer, so a moment within a ceremony where you are taking the opportunity to demonstrate your gratitude, usually audibly to yourself, essentially, for all the things that are good. So this is a meditation essentially about bringing your attention to everything in your life that's positive. Good relationships you've got, the fact you've got enough food, the fact you've got opportunities, blah blah blah. In other bits of the ceremony, there may be obviously other processes you want to do. There are bits of ceremony, bits of life, which involve us, laughing and crying. That's the way it goes.
They can be emotionally, charged times. Typically, what would you advise people bring in a practical sense, in a physical sense, to an evening or a moment like that? Like, is it the intention on paper? Could it be a stuffed toy? What is the, it doesn't have to be so.
I don't know. It depends what you're going to, doesn't it? I mean, if you're going to a rave, you'll need all the usual rave stuff, glow sticks and chewing gum. I think that if most of the ceremony kind of structures that I am familiar with involve a period of sitting down, usually around a special magic thing, a table with some stuff on it, and which provides physical focus, and then spending some time, in that space, maybe moving around, dancing, whatever. But what matters most, I think, is to bring to that space your or rather to ensure that you bring to that space a genuine sense that you're comfortable with traveling with these people. Yeah, this is an intimate experience. This is an experience that taking any drug that significantly affects your perception is a moment of kind of power and vulnerability and
Absolutely.
trust and all that stuff. Yeah. So what matters most, to be honest, is that you trust all the people you're going to be flying with tonight. Yeah, that's I think beyond everything else. I remember talking to my eldest son about this, and this is something that's related in getting higher, where he said, "What's the big deal with acid? I don't get why it's such a big deal." And we talked about various things, and I said, "Well, it's like you can look at the trees and go, 'Hey, look at all the little faces in the trees,' or you can look at the trees and go, 'Look at all the little faces in the trees.'" And the difference between the two things is mostly to do with who you're hanging out with and where you are.
So interesting.
Yeah, so that's the important bit. Not that you can't have difficult stuff in an otherwise kind of beneficial, useful trip. So the most important thing to bring to a ceremony is a sense that you are comfortable to be in this ceremony with all these other people. And you may be like new, you maybe don't know very many people, but you should get like a good vibe, a good sense. And also to have a sense that people are being thoughtful about just kind of protocols and being careful about dosage and all this sort of stuff. It's just you want you want people who are good, you know, who listen, um, listen to the people who are there and don't have that whole big I'm the shaman with my comedy hat on and I know what's best for you.
Yeah,
I
it's a
don't
lot.
like that very much. I don't think that's very helpful.
No, I think that takes a real strong essence of open-mindedness before anyone takes part in anything like this, be it as you refer to even a nightclub as a potential scenario for a ceremony, which is very interesting, by the way, because not many people say that. Like and when people talk about, I hate to use this phrase, Julian, but the club drugs,
Mm.
it's never often referred to as that is completely ceremonial. It's people that are getting bang out their minds together. The room is in love. No one has a bad time really in those scenarios.
Everyone dresses up in a special magic costume.
T-
Some of them also put feathers in their hair. They
yeah.
use a substance which is like, you know, a couple of chemical tweaks away from mescaline. They have the same drum rhythm that you have in the peyote circle, absolutely the same.
Yes, absolutely.
Beat your heartbeat, 140 BPM. That's what you do. It's the same, but different. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's exactly the same thing. And I think that that's, um, you know, and I speak as some, you know, I'm an occultist. I like this kind of stuff, and I also spent quite a number of years clubbing in Bristol, and it was fantastic, and Brighton, and this is a ceremonial activity, and it's you know part of the thing about the peyote circle. I remember talking to one shaman who was kind of you know been running this stuff, Native American church, doing it for donkey's years, and he
Hmm.
said to me, a really sensible thing. He said, in psychoanalysis, what we do is we bring up our problems and we look at them and we check them out and then we kind of deal with them and we unpick them. And he said, that's cool. That's a good way of doing it. But in the peyote circle, what we do is we summon up this big love vibe and we use this to kind of push out all the shit, all the horrible stuff that we don't need in our lives, just to give us a breathing space, if nothing else. Raving does exactly the same thing.
It's very true.
Yeah, raving does exactly the same thing. It's the same behavior. And yes, of course, it can be like hedonistic and scribbled out and just, you know, there's bad stuff. Of course there is. That's humans for you.
Mm.
But it's a remarkably safe medicine. It has huge benefits for people in a psychotherapeutic and healing context. And for many people, that recreation, that recreation of being able to go out, you know, raving at the weekend,
Mm.
you know, it does the same kind of thing the peyote ceremony does. Particularly, I mean, bear in mind, the peyote circle is from an oppressed people who've had like a genocide waged against them.
Mm.
You know, in North America, that's their storyline. So they use this, if nothing else, to hold them through that experience to deal with things like the endemic alcoholism within some of those communities.
Sure.
And so yeah,
Wow.
raving. It's a ceremony. It's a
That
cer-
is, yeah, yeah. And there's a necessity to do it as well. I think there is that urge of within contemporary culture of, people working jobs they don't in essence wants to do. The weekend rolls around. There's a need for relief, I think. And yeah, that's insane. So to bring you back to ceremony, you speak about earlier about the importance of everyone being pretty open-minded and how do you is there time spent integrating people before and obviously after, but before the ceremonies too? You must have to look and think like, hey, someone's going to get this wrong tonight. What's the dose for this person? Like, how are the minor intricacies planned out?
Man, it depends so much on the group, depends on like, you know, I mean, there's experiences I have had, and then there's other kind of like groups and the way they do things. Um, I mean, firstly, with a lot of the kind of organic materials, there's a quite a good kind of, you know, they're very safe. Yeah, they're very, very safe. And there are certain kind of drug combinations and certain problematic things you can get with those that can be tricky. Actually, most of the time within, I guess, what we would call the medicine community, so people going on like an ayahuasca session,
Mhm.
um, certainly you can rock up to a Santa Daime ceremony, let's say in somewhere where it's safe and legal to do so, and you can go through the ceremony and then you can just leave and you can never see those people again, never. Yeah, it's not modeled like a kind of a sort of psychotherapeutic structure where, you know, I talk to you for 3 sessions beforehand about what's going to happen, and then we go and do the thing, and then I talk to you for another 3 sessions about what happened.
Mhm.
It's not about that. It's not about that. And often in those communities, in those medicine circle communities, people don't even talk about their experiences very much. they'll talk about them a bit, but it's not like, we come from a kind of Protestant community where we have to confess all of our stuff because we don't actually get proper confession like Catholics. And so
Yeah.
we have to tell everyone, oh, I did this ayahuasca and this happened to me, and this happened and this happened. And, maybe I can even embarrassingly write a book about what happened and how how I've got this new revelation. I mean, it's a thing, and in a lot of those medicine communities, people don't, there's not so much of a frame around it. If I'm doing work with people which is more, let's call it either, I kind of hesitate to use the word sort of therapeutic because it has perhaps difficult connotations, but where that person is coming for an individual experience and they have a particular thing they want to work with, then in that case, yes, you would spend a lot of time beforehand because you're helping set up their set by talking to them about, okay, so what's the thing you want to explore and how do you see that and what do you think might happen and blah blah blah, and then holding that experience and then afterwards kind of going, okay, so let's reflect on that, let's see how that how that integrates with other things. That's a different deal. That's a much more explicitly therapeutic kind of arc through the experience. Whereas, you and I know that you can go raving and no one phones you up on a Tuesday and says, so Johnny, is it okay? You're feeling a bit depressed now. Did you take the 5-HTP and eat the bananas? Because
Yeah.
you really should have. I mean, that's not how it works. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in a therapeutic setting, yes, you definitely want a good entry conversation, series of conversations, then the psychedelic experience. And bear in mind, the psychedelics don't just magically fix things. They give you an opportunity to see things in a new way. It's up to you to then do stuff. And then you might have to return to them in however long and get another kind of, okay, so it's not like a one-hit wonder. I take this drug and suddenly everything is peachy in my life.
Hmm.
You know?
No, yeah, I think from my own experience, Julian, I would say that well, first of all, I've never been someone who advocates this whole um, this egoic side of, oh, you have to take this amount, you haven't visited God, or you haven't seen the other side until you've done this. And I find that awfully frightening and kind of new age in many ways. But where I did find some real relief and therapy was in using little and often. Let me put it like that. And having moments where I've had the opportunity to self-reflect on, for example, arguments with friends where I've completely realized that it was all the other way around, or a scenario or something I've said that I've realized I actually hurt myself by doing. And I think I'm someone who I think I prefer that side of things, and I think it's interesting that people should know that there is this benefit there as well, because I think as much as there is ceremony in the rave, there also, as you say, there's a lot of other things to go with the rave. There's alcohol, very many heavy distractions. There can be aggression in the rave. There are other substances that circulate the rave that can break the rave, and
Yeah, yeah.
they affect people differently. So that's something I'm pretty interested in. I wanted to ask about, you have advocated that this is also fun, and it should
Yeah,
be fun, and
yeah.
that you've advocated drawing, for example, as a form of expression, jumping and dancing. I mean, this must be difficult depending on how much people have endured of this various substance.
Well, it depends, doesn't it, really? I mean, ain't much you can do if you've taken a hit of 5-MeO, really. You want to most might be able to stand up, possibly. I generally can't. Uh, but yeah, I mean, if you've taken acid and you've got like a good 6-7 hours to play with, minimum, probably, you're gonna have stuff to kind of, you can't just expect the drugs to do all the work. You've got to create or curate a really nice environment to be in,
Totally.
um, so whether that's kind of with a bunch of friends kind of walking and exploring stuff and making art with found materials in the landscape, all of that sort of thing, that's a way of doing it. You just need to sort of think about, it's not news, is it? Setting and substance. Yeah, what are we going to be taking? How do we feel about this, and where are we going to be? That's it. And find building that in a really good and helpful way, so you get the most out of it. And particularly going back to your thing about like the heroic dose, I've said this before, which is that the heroic. I've taken a heroic dose of whiskey. I don't think that makes me a better person than anyone else. I've also taken like 2 glasses of nice wine with my meal. I enjoyed that experience and think I got more out of it than the heroic dose of whiskey.
Sure.
It just now means I can't drink whiskey at all because it's disgusting. Whatever.
Yeah.
So like for some people, for some of the time, high dose experiences are great and they're beneficial. And there are certain circumstances, I think, when certain models of therapeutic use, for example, where they're great. Equally, you can keep your teeth clean by kind of doing it regularly for a short period of time, rather than just like for an hour every 2 weeks. Yeah. So you can use psychedelics in a way that's much more gentle, depending on, of course, on what the substance or substances you're using, and just have these little incursions into the psychedelic space. And there's something quite interesting from that. I learned this in a conference in Prague this year, which was, if you look at the effects of, say, the subjective effect of, say, breath work, and you plot the subjective effect, across various these standard questionnaires, you plot the phenomenology of it, and you plot mid-range or low range psilocybin.
Okay.
The experience is subjectively the same, with the exception of one variable, which is that from breath work, people find it easier to integrate whatever the insights are in their daily life than they are with psilocybin.
Okay.
And if you think it through, it kind of makes sense that something that's a bit more kind of just weird and out there is harder to make sense of when you're back in the room. But if it's something you've kind of gone into because it's just embedded in your biology, you can sort of bring that through into manifestation in whatever form a little bit better. But the main important message about this was that both of these states, these what we could call kind of low dose psychedelic states, are really powerful. They are really powerful. They can, they do real stuff. You don't have to just take more and more. That sounds awfully like a kind of capitalist project gone mad. We just need more ayahuasca. That's all we need. Give us more ayahuasca and everything will be fixed.
But it is quite concerning though, isn't it, Julian? Because it seems to be there's a lot of there's too much out there about people trying to a game of one-upmanship in this kind of thing, where it's who's seen more, who's gone further, what's there to see. But if it's all in you, surely it's got to be.
I don't know, because I think sometimes it's what people hear in their with that anxiety, and I understand that.
Okay.
So you take this Kalindi. So Kalindi, guy, amazing guy, lovely guy. Talks about high dose mushroom stuff. And again, I was at a conference with him recently, and he stood up and said, "Look," he said, "in my opinion, any dose of psychedelics is a heroic dose. Any dose, because it's not about how much you take." And he's not. Yeah, he talks about this as an experience.
Yeah.
He's not saying everyone should take 30 grams of mushrooms, because the guy's a wise man. He knows that. Apart from anything else, like I say to him, like, "Kalindi, you're a massive guy. Like, I'm a little dude. Yeah, you want 30 grams. That's like my 10, yeah, or whatever." It's not about that. It's not, anyone. We can fixate on this as a behavior, but I think we should just laugh at it and go, "Hey, yeah, whatever. You took loads of shit. Brilliant."
Yeah, true. Because I think McKenna left a lot of that sort of residue over with his.
Yeah, I mean,
The party doesn't start until 5. These are quotes, right? There's quite an element of that there.
they are. But then we also have to think about when this guy is and what. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on there. And equally, there's what people say in public, to some extent, and particularly a kind of someone who was like representing in such a kind of a formidable way as Terence did. And there's also what they do. And Terence is just like a big stoner, like a massive stoner, and just not that. The stories of him and Dennis taking these insane doses over long periods of time. Yes, of course, that's exactly the kind of crazy stuff that young men are designed to do. That's what some of them should be doing.
Yeah.
But I mean, yeah, he certainly, Terence McKenna certainly kind of like laid his trip down in a really big way. But of course, embedded throughout that,
As a wordsmith, I guess.
yeah, and embedded throughout that is that there's a lot of kind of he does say, "This is me. I say this. I'm talking about this," and he does kind of put uncertainty in there. And the guy's dead, and he was probably, if he was alive now, be saying other stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that's a real sad case, because I often think about what someone like Terence would say today as a reflection on his own work and how he is on the internet, and particularly YouTube. It seems to me that there's an element of like, this guy might have been a little bit of a piss taker amongst many things, but a very charming one at that, to the core.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like, one of my great heroes is Aleister Crowley, and he's exactly the same. So the guy, sets up all these crazy religions, and at the same time says, basically, think for yourself and question authority, and that don't believe me, cut your own way through the jungle of ideas. By the way, here's my crazy channeled book from like you know,
Yeah.
an alien angel being that tells you about how everything should be.
Wow.
So inconsistency, exactly. That's part of the delight of those people.
That's the charisma behind it, isn't it, really? That's really the
Yeah,
charisma
yeah,
I
yeah, yeah,
find.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, you've got
It's
to,
not.
it has to be slightly crazy, really, I
Yeah.
think.
Julian, I wanted to ask you before we move on to the next area about any tips you've had for integration post ceremony that may be on your book that you find rather relevant.
Time. Just take
Time,
time.
time.
Take time. Just take time and be gentle with yourself and the people around you. You know, get some food, get some sleep. You know, I often joke with my children, particularly when they were younger. We used to say that a lot of the problem that world leaders had is they just needed like a little bit more sleep and a bit of a lie down, perhaps a biscuit or something, you know, to chill. You know, we live in a culture where it's like, how must I integrate? What should I be doing to integrate this thing? I must strive to integrate it. And it's like, look, you've just had a big experience. Just lie down for a bit. Yeah. Just go and find a nice bit of beach or a forest or wherever you feel comfortable and just chill for a bit. That's why in the rave, when our culture invented the shamanic experience of we call rave, we had a
Mm.
room where you were designed to just like, oh, just lie down and float around for a little bit. That's what you need to do. By all means, of course, talk to people, draw things, write things, um, express things artistically. Um, Once you've had enough time to reflect, make changes that perhaps you were inspired to make in those visionary moments,
Mhm.
if that's what happened. Once you've had time to reflect, you know, don't immediately phone your ex-girlfriend to express how shitty you were. She probably knows that. Um, at least in her opinion.
Yeah.
Uh, so just time.
Have you ever had any experience with people that have struggled to come back
From where?
from well, like that? I mean, from difficult experiences. So let's say they need a little bit more support days after, maybe not hours. Let's say days. And what's the
Yeah,
advice
yeah,
there?
yeah. Well, I think I don't know. I don't think people necessarily struggle. The thing about psychedelic drugs is they are generally over, unless you have some very unfortunate, persistent hallucinatory kind of problem. They will
Mhm.
wear off.
Okay.
What you're left with is you're left with your thoughts about the world as they stand. And of course, psychedelics, as well as healing people, one of the ways that they actually do this is by stirring up lots of content, lots of material. And that's where you need a sangha. That's one of the things I was going to add in terms of, as well as time, you need a community, whether that's an online community, whether that's, I mean, some of the work that I do is people, basically I provide a service where people kind of Skype me and tell me about what's happened. And I, as far as I can, give
Mhm.
them an opportunity to kind of just reflect on that. And there are lots of other people that do similar work, either face to face or
Sure.
whatever. And it's just about having a community. It's about having someone who's been in a similar sort of altered state of awareness and is it can be kind of reasonably empathic about the fact that we're humans and we all suffer and we all have, you know, our challenges, all of us, whoever we
Yes,
are. It's a
absolutely.
thing, and has a bit of time to listen and maybe kind of maybe make some advice. The advice is normally get outside, have some food, find some people to be with. That's nearly always what you need to do. But sometimes we need to say that to someone. I need to say that to someone else in order to hear it back to myself. This is like the prayer thing, yeah? I have
Yeah,
to
okay.
visualize it in order to, and we do this all the time. You know, you phone up IT support and say, "Oh, I don't know how it's working." And as you say it, you go, "Oh, I get it. Yeah, yeah, yeah."
Yeah.
That's what you need. And all of us, when we come back from a psychedelic experience, allowing for this thing about, you know, whether we're in a situation where we want to just hold on to it, let it gestate for a while, or we feel that we need to kind of, you know, talk to someone. We all need to make sense of it, and the way we make sense of anything is in relationship with other people. That's what it seems to me like. um so yeah, you know, having people to talk with. Have I encountered people who've had difficult experiences? Yeah, of course, of course. I mean, you know, it happens. It's um and very often people can have like experiences that are really great, but there's one bit that they need to go, oh yeah, but there was this moment where blah blah blah,
Mhm.
or there was this bit I wasn't sure about, or this bit felt really weird, and you go, oh yeah, okay, well let's chat about that and see if we can explore it a little bit. And often that's the seed. It's like the piece of grit that gets into the oyster that makes the pearl. Yeah. So often that, for me anyway, I'll come back from a psychedelic experience with like a real, everything is groovy. Oh yeah, there was that one little irritation. Well, that one little irritation often in the next experience will be the thing that then opens into the next insight. Yeah, for me, I don't know if that works for other people like that, but it seems to me that that's often something that psychedelics do. We talk about being these. Yes, they can be blissful. Yes, they can be joyful. Yes, they can be all this stuff. Yes, they can be healing. And part of what they do to heal is that they expose the wounds. Yeah, so you can deal with them, and it doesn't immediately fix them. It just means, hey, this is the thing. You need to approach this now. You need to give attention to this now. So yeah, having opportunities to do that. However you as a psychonaut find that, whether you find it on social media, you find it from talking to someone online, or you find it face to face with a community, which generally is one of the best ways of doing it. That's cool. That's cool. It's an important thing to do.
Sure. So moving on to this third wave, this new renaissance that we see coming around, well, maybe the intersection of science and spirituality. I wanted to pick your brain on the idea of say, we see psilocybin coming through now, which has been pushed by MAPS and John Hopkins. Sorry, MDMA is with John Hopkins, I believe, is it, or vice versa? How fragile is this moment we have, do you think, Julian? Because obviously we had this, in the mid 50s to mid 60s, and it was fragile. And it took one evangelist, maybe a little bit of Tim Leary's help in over promoting something for how good it is before we see the counterculture crushed. And I feel like it's something we don't really mention a lot now because things seem so good, like that it is happening and people are doing great things. But I would be a little bit worried about corporate interest in this, or when I read about people pumping 20 million into Silicon Valley startups for microdosing testing with LSD for the benefit of, I don't know, a new application for the iPhone. These things scare me tremendously.
Yeah. I for one welcome my robot AI overlords. But man, I mean, there are multiple truths. I mean, in the sense that I know, quite well characters like Ben Sessa and people who are working on the MDMA psychotherapy program. These are good people with a good heart and a very good intention, and their intention is to bring this massively valuable therapeutic medicine, often to people who aren't going out raving in communities and settings where that's not a thing. Were it to be a thing, maybe they wouldn't be coming to Ben's consulting room. But there are people who can benefit from this stuff. Is it going to take it outside the hands of an illegal black market? Well, no, not unless the medics can provide it cheaper, and they can't at the moment. A kilo of MDMA is terribly expensive if you want it through a license. But I think that so the medicalization thing, I don't see that as like a terrifying incursion of the man into our otherwise illicit but nevertheless groovy underworld. I actually think that all the moves with getting our laws to reflect what people do and getting them to appreciate the benefits of these substances and better ways of holding them within culture, even those ones that are really problematic, with things like opiates and stimulants like cocaine. We can't have those prohibited either. We have to manage this in a much more intelligent way. Yeah, and yes, it will cause things like companies will start to exist who will proliferate, who will, as has already happened, sell back weed to us in all kinds of crazy packaged ways.
Sure.
Some of which will be quite cool and groovy. Of course, this is how it works. Yeah, it's gonna be all of the above. There will be both, things that are real general, what we might call liberalization of legislation, which will be really helpful, and there will be attempts at corporate takeover, and there will be all sorts of things in the mix. I think what we have to understand is that there is no magical reason, quotes, that this is all going the way it's going. We have to actively advocate and work for this. And however we do this, whether we do it by just being by kind of witnessing our own experience of the benefits of some of these substances, by talking about how most of the damage and deaths and problems that result from the drug trade are an effect of prohibition and they're not mitigated by prohibition. And being aware of the fact that allowing people to kind of autonomously have these experiences in a range of different settings, and to be able, importantly, to produce these substances themselves where possible, given the fact that we can grow cannabis, peyote, and mushrooms. That's no problem. That's the, there's the big three covered. That's fine. We have to actively engage with this. We have to, people have to be sort of thoughtful about it, and there will be difficult calls. MAPS had to take the, there was a recent situation, I guess you're probably familiar with, where MAPS was offered some substantial funding from a donor who wanted the money to go to MDMA psychotherapy, but they wanted it to be ring fenced for only veterans, right? So this is a right-wing organization,
Sure.
as I understand it. Now, Rick Doblin and the team there had to make a decision. They had to make a decision based around this, an ethical decision. And the logic ran, well, if we help these veterans, it's not like that stops anyone else being helped. In fact, it actually helps fast track the medicine, so that other people can benefit from it. And they decided to take the money. Now, I respect them for that decision, and I think I would probably have done the same thing. But I also recognise, and I think I'm sure Rick would say this too, that we have to be thoughtful about it. And again, I saw a presentation this summer by Rick, and he was saying exactly this. He talked about it not was it not snatching defeat from the jaws of success or something. I think it was that way around. He was kind of saying we're nearly there. We have to do this really, really carefully. MDMA is going to be licensed as a breakthrough therapy in the United States very soon, within, I guess, probably 5 years, I think is the timetable. So this will be happening. It will be there. And we will start to have the benefits of this within our culture. Now, I think that psychedelics are powerful enough agents of social change that if we can bring them back into European culture, Euro-American culture, we might help fix the primary culture which has been responsible for predating on the rest of the planet for the last, 1,000 years at least. Yeah. So I think that there are real benefits in these substances, and whether we're doing it through the medical discourse, whether we're doing it through religious stuff, whether we're doing it through autonomy of production and encouraging people to have the tech and the ability to grow their own psychedelics, this is all of this matters, and it matters that there's a spread of different stuff. What I would worry about is if someone said, you can only take this stuff, or same with the objection I have to some of the ayahuasca stuff, which is like, this is the magic medicine, everything else is bullshit. It's like, no, man, this is another valuable ally in the experience of being human.
How will we get, as you say, they all need to come through, they all need to get over the line? How will we do that? Because obviously we know that, for example, psilocybin is probably easier to talk about in terms of legality, because not really many people know what that is. But LSD has an awful stigma that's still deeply ingrained in its culture. It's been left over from the 60s and 70s, and so that's going to be very hard, I think.
A lot of those people are going to be dead soon. A lot of those people are going to be dead soon.
True.
And then there's, okay, so how old are you? Yeah.
27.
27. Right. So I'm 50. Yeah, I just had a birthday. Level up 50. Extra combo moves. Fantastic. So, the generation like you, who are younger than me, like, for many, many, many people, this is just known. This is in the culture. This is orderable on the internet, and many people have engaged with this culture, and they've seen that not only is it interesting, but also what they, or more importantly, their parents were told about it was lies.
Sure.
And if they've studied any further, they've realized, and it was based on racism, and it was based on, the whole fear that America had with the civil rights movement and blah, blah, blah. And you unpick the story pretty quickly if you know how to use Wikipedia. Yeah.
Sure.
So I think that a lot of those things will simply change over time with culture. And bear in mind, we have had very different scenarios. I mean, I sometimes, I go on about the story of Eleusis and the Temple of Demeter, and how this was the center of the ancient Greek-speaking world and the center of Europe, and how this was a psychedelic ritual that all of our leaders went through. And people kind of like groove on it, but sometimes I think they don't get, like, this is actually it. So like the people who are the equivalent of Theresa May and Donald Trump and all of these people, they were going through a psychedelic experience where they realized that there was, in a sense, no death, because in a sense there was no self. and that happened for 1,000 years.
Sure.
Now, maybe, if you could get a lot of the people who are the, let's call them the decision makers, yeah,
Hmm.
or rich or whoever, and actually this is happening in a lot of ways. Actually, it's quite interesting going through these experiences. Maybe that would give them, if we genuinely believe the psychedelic experience has a kind of a benefit to us and our species, perhaps that might help. Because in the time that European culture has been disconnected from the psychedelic state, we have had two world wars, nuclear weapons, mass slavery, genocide,
Yeah.
the despoiling of the whole of the developed world, and now we have made the ice caps melt, and we are doing nothing about this.
Mhm.
Yeah. Now, I would suggest that that's a culture which is addicted and ill and could really benefit from
Absolutely.
a big high dose of psilocybin and then a bit of a lie down and a sleep and then a biscuit and then a bit of a chat afterwards, a bit of a talk about how it's been feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if that was
It's
a person, we'd say, oh, well, mate, psychedelic therapy might actually help you. But because it's a whole culture and because the idea seems crazy,
mhm.
but this is how we ran it. This is how the ancient world ran in Europe.
Sure. Essentially, I often ponder the idea that the current mental health crisis in the West is got to be the door for these substances to unlock finally, because since the invention of SSRIs, and I'm not very clued up on those, I don't think they've been too successful. And I'm wondering, Julian, why are so many people going astray at the moment? Young people as well, particularly between the ages of 18 and 35. I think the ratio is around 5 to 1 men to women on suicidal attempts, and I find that frightening. And what is it? What is it about this culture now? Is it advertising? Is it cubicle jobs? Is it technology? Or is there something seedy going on here where people are given, I think, false ideas about what life is meant to be about? These substances have to, what is it they do that they bring back this that helps us move forward, be it end of life anxiety, or be it just anxiety, treatment resistant depression? What is fundamentally wrong when you mention this sickness?
Man, it's an interesting question, isn't it? I don't know. There are probably lots and lots of factors in there and lots of things. I do know that with my two children, both of whom are boys, I
Hmm.
know the thing that's most likely to kill them, at least at the moment, statistically, is them. And that's a really unnerving thing. But it's
Sure.
also interesting because I kind of think about a generation of people who kind of, even more than me, grew up with video games, and the idea that, man, this is all really shit. My life is rubbish. I'm just going to kill myself and respawn somewhere else, and that'll be fine. It
Yeah.
might be better in the next iteration of the game. I also respect that as a way of actually dealing with it. Although I hope that we have fewer and fewer young people deciding to do that. I think the problems are that we have massive social inequality. Everyone's economically disenfranchised, which means that people get this sense that they're just like scrabbling just to stay still. And
Hmm.
yet we have a culture where we have potentially tremendous like abundance of resource and so on, which even if we shared it out globally would look a sight much nicer than it does now. So I think that's one of the ways that things like socialism, and even that doesn't answer the question, but it's an interesting thing. You can see that certainly in Britain there was like at the last general election, there's a whole real new thing of like young people in their 20s going, oh, this is an interesting idea. Like, imagine if all the water was just free and you just had water. Wouldn't that be great? You know. So I think one of the things that people are struggling with is this idea that I'm born into the situation, and even though I know intellectually, culturally, historically, that I'm massively affluent, I don't feel massively affluent. In fact, I feel massively pressured by all this stuff just to survive as a biological unit, and just to get enough bio survival tokens in order to pay for my next, whatever. Um, I think that we have actually lack of information in the sense that if you live in a city and you
Hmm.
look out the window, you see much less information out there than you would if you live in a woodland. And if you go walking in a woodland, you'll be absolutely showered, literally, with information. And actually, what we do is we have we crush ourselves down to these points of awareness in order to be on our smartphone. That's cool. I love my smartphone. It's brilliant. But also, about then having the opportunity to recognize that, and most people do this quite successfully, but it's really important to be able to kind of put those things aside, put those things away, go and engage in other spaces, and have this diversity of experience, which if you haven't got any money is really hard to do, you
Absolutely.
know. And if you haven't got any models from the generation above you saying, hey, guy, this is how you do it, even if you haven't got any cash, then it's really difficult. It's really, really difficult. Most of the people that I know, most of the young people I know who've killed themselves have had two issues going on. They've taken refuge in opiate style drugs, fentanyl and the new wave of like super crazy opiates, or generation above that, or a few years above that, ketamine. And they've been really broke. They've owed people money somewhere down the line, or they've had a sense that there was no, man, I'm never going to get the thing that I see on YouTube with this dude doing stuff. Why is that then? I'm just a person. And that sense of like hopelessness, it's like, well, yeah, I'm just going to respawn, see if the next one's any better. And I totally understand that. And it's rubbish. What a rubbish situation to get into. Here we all are, affluent, well fed to the point where where many of us are overweight, and we've created a culture that's so fucked up that we just kill ourselves. Our youth just kill themselves. That's what we do. That's the way we deal with it. It's like uh, previously we would have a war, and I hope very much that doesn't happen. But I also hope very much that in terms of this conversation, that some of the lessons and the experiences of, let's call it the psychedelic state, those other ways of seeing the world, can lead to people finding better ways to be in relationship with each other. And that includes like economically, and we see this. I mean, I see a lot of green shoots. I see a lot of kind of good ideas and a lot of positive stuff out there. I just hope that, like everyone, I hope that those new things can flourish in a good way before we cut down too many more of the trees.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think we are sort of in danger of doing that because we're sicker physically than we ever have been before here, as well as mentally. And there's shitloads to buy into that as well. City living, city food, shitty food. Perhaps there's a better way of integrating that. Can I ask you about any notable personal experiences? So my ambition behind this podcast, Julian, is because 2 years ago I lost my best friend to suicide, and he was just a little older than me. I think he was 31 at the time. And ever since then, I've been incredibly analytical of what was going on with him. But my anger towards the whole thing that I don't deny I had once upon a time has passed. But I've sort of found through my own bouts of, I like to call it cloudy weather, or I used to have, I put real distance between them with getting back in contact with the feelings of what life might be. Now, for example, I don't mean to sound sort of like a hippie here, but after a few certain experiences with various fungus in the right places, I was able to sort of feel that this is what I wanted to analyze spiritualism and science, and with taking the abstract of taking religion away. I used to call myself an atheist, Julian, and I might well still do, but I feel like there's something. I had this notion shift in my life that there was something more going on here, and that might just be in the way the plants grow and the wind blows. Do you know what I mean? There was just something.
Yeah. Listen, I'm really sorry to hear that. That's your story, and I think that the only thing I can say beyond understanding, not through personal experience, but in imagining how difficult that would be, is that I think part of our work as people, people talk about like doing their work when they take the daime, they take the ayahuasca and stuff like this. Part of what we need to do is part of the difficulty that the hurt that we find in ourselves, and what obscures the sun on the cloudy days, is not just our own shit. It's not just our own personal stuff. It's the stuff we're carrying from the whole of our culture. I live in England, man. There's loads of, like, the place is crazy, and it's been crazy for a long time. And my ancestors would have been press ganged into running the machines for the largest empire the planet had ever seen, which despoiled the whole of India and America and whatever. Now, we carry that in ourselves, as well as our individual, I had a really difficult relationship with my, whatever.
Sure.
So when we find those things, and also then if someone like you carry with that within yourself the hurt and the difficulty of that experience with your best friend, and our work is to try and find ways to transform that into something that can be beneficial to ourselves and all other beings. So however we do that, so here's a podcast, just a way of offering some of that. Here's your own practice and a way of finding a way of being with these ideas of, whether we call it spirituality or whatever, and science. And I don't see these as at all separate. In fact, historically, I think you can make an argument for them being absolutely cut from the same cloth,
Okay.
but that's perhaps another story. So this is what we do. We a lot of there's no point in me going on about my own personal experiences in any detail, except to say that what I try and do is I try and find where there are hurts in me and hurts in my culture, and see if I can turn that into something good for myself and people around me. That's the message. If shamanism, aside of the crazy hats and the lineages and all that, if shamanism is a function within people, like an ability that people have inherently, then it's this wounded healer thing. It's this thing about, like, you take the hurt and you work with that,
Sure.
you take that into the psychedelic experience, you learn from that, and you open to that in a way that, like a knot in wood, allows you to open out, and it is less influential on your daily life, but it still informs you, and it allows you then to kind of to turn that into something good, to turn that into a source of strength to do something good in the world.
Absolutely, absolutely. I really couldn't agree with that more. That's a great statement. I really appreciate that, Julian. I've always found that you're not going to put, you're not going to give these issues a proverbial kick in the bollocks by not sort of understanding that it's your weight to carry. I suppose you hear a lot about Jordan Peterson, for whatever you think of him, or what you might think of him in contemporary social media. He often does put this quote out. He's like, well, what is the thing that hurts you the most, and how heavy is it? Can you carry that? And I think there's so much in that, in a moral sense, despite that he gets kind of maybe torn apart for his religious views within there,
Yeah. I mean, I think that if I look at my own story, and I look at the stories of my friends, and I can see many examples of this where people have taken the thing that was their hurt, and they've transformed it into something good.
Mm.
Um, and this is also about this thing of the psychedelic state, kind of where you sort of go beyond the self. You start to realize that, yes, there is you and your stuff and your burden and all those things, and that's kind of true. But also that psychedelics typically, they destabilize the boundary between self and other, whether it's self and the wallpaper, or whether it's self and another human, or self and the
Sure.
sky. That's what they do. And so I think that this burden that you carry, it's also that, it's about finding ways that we can carry these things. That's part of the reason that, going back to the psychedelic ceremony thing, I like to do work. I really enjoy collaborating and working with other people. So I do lots of work, with small groups of people, with, groups on retreat and blah blah blah. Um, because I learn so much from that, from being in those kind of relationships. So yes, it's about carrying your burden, but it's also about, like the whole integration thing again. It's about being able to have opportunities to find a community within which we can at least acknowledge each other's burdens, even if we don't carry them for each other.
Yeah.
That's I think important.
And that's got to be part and parcel of really releasing the energy. Are you familiar with Dr. Gabor Mate, Julian?
Yeah. Not hugely with his work, but what I've seen I've really liked, and seems like a cool dude.
Right. So essentially, he speaks about the idea that trauma is in your cultural history, and that trauma it can lead to many chronic illnesses. One of
Uh,
the things he brings up, for example, is that a study that was done that was, and I won't comment on this too much, but that African American women were more prone to asthma, and that's got
mhm.
nothing to do with body physique or weight size. He believes it to be in the history of how these people were treated,
Yeah.
and he does all these. He gives crazy examples of that, and how he brings it into that you have to release this, but it takes not just your culture, but the other person's culture to admit this too.
There's a lot
Just
of stuff. I mean, there's a friend of mine, Darren Springer, who talks a lot about so he's kind of Afro-Caribbean kind of British guy, and he talks about what he calls post-traumatic slave syndrome, and he talks about, like, how a lot of kind of African or
yeah,
yeah, sort of British Caribbean culture and African cultures in Britain how this stuff is embedded within the culture, and it has like there are, you know, what happens with all of us is that when we have a really bad, you know, when we are oppressed for a long time, we internalize that oppression, and the oppressor doesn't even have to bother doing anything. They just, you know, let this thing run itself. So I can't breathe, I can't survive, I can't live. Oh, look, I've got asthma. They don't have to do anything. In fact, they can clean the air up and I'll still have the asthma. Doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have to think about this. There's other examples of this, very straightforward down the line scientific examples from things like the Dutch hunger winter and the epigenetic effects associated with it. So people who are listening don't know that, go and have a look. Basically, it's about genetic effects which go on into the third generation, which down the male line is particularly strange because, you know, this is to do with DNA switching, and it's not to do with inheritance of you know, eggs. It was basically to do with a bunch of during the Nazi occupation, a bunch of women who were pregnant, who had children, because they'd been starved effectively at one point during their pregnancy. Their children had a tendency to become obese.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting in that is that you can see that this tracking of this trauma to this group of women who were pregnant with these babies into 3 generations down the line. Just standard scientific stuff, you know, nothing woo, nothing particularly strange, but an unusual and interesting effect, because it means that even if we just take aside the whole kind of like magic spooky energy thing, which we may or may not groove on, we know that our behaviors, the environments that we are in, are communicable in genetic terms to our children and our children's children. That's a big deal. That's a
Sure.
big deal.
That is a big deal.
You know, and that has all kinds of implications when you sort of start to think it through. So this is the thing about, you know, let's imagine you don't take crazy jungle drugs, you just do mindfulness. You just have a practice of doing mindfulness meditation. Notice your breath, notice you haven't just thinking about something else, notice your breath again, rinse and repeat, 20 minutes. Do that, do it pretty regularly.
Yeah.
Not only are you helping yourself, but you're helping at least 3 generations down the line of you.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah. So, you know, it would seem to be a cool thing to do. Why not do that?
Absolutely.
Do that.
Right, Julian, as I don't want to keep you all evening, I'm sure you're very busy. I'd like to move on now to the conference in Berlin next week and your talk on drugs in modern culture, and basically what is meant by magic and defined, because I didn't know a lot about this before speaking to you. I know you're half there, like maybe it's a big subject.
No, man, it's a good question. It's a very good question. Best question.
Because I don't want people to, and please, you know, I mean no disrespect to this, but if you throw that word around, if I do the word magic or culture, maybe it's involuntarily within me, but it brings to mind something kind of dark, and maybe there was, I mean, I come from a Catholic background, right? So my family all come from Ireland. So there's always been that, don't cross on the stairs. My mum used to say, don't put your new shoes on the table. It was all very, you know, it was all kind of suspect of other things that might be there or thereabouts. And I pulled a quote out from you. I hope you don't mind. I don't think I paraphrased it, but it's something I got from another podcast where you said, magic is a willingness to entertain the possibility that the imagination may have the ability to influence things that are not seemingly obvious. And I absolutely love that, because I think it goes deeper into not just intention, but hope and belief and how those might overlap. And I was wondering if you could bring that back into, if this is relevant to your talk next weekend.
I mean, the talk next weekend is interesting because most of the time these days I find myself addressing kind of audiences of people who are interested in the psychedelic experience. And so it's going to be interesting to be talking to a bunch of occultists or people who are, you know, clearly fascinated by that, which is my kind of sort of ground zero in terms of my own kind of practice. And basically, I have no idea why I'm interested in this. I've just always been interested in this stuff. And I've come to the idea that what magic is it's a body of technique. It's an unfolding tradition or body of technique, corpus of activities, which are about imagination and the body, and very often altered states of awareness, which is where they link into the kind of psychedelic drugs thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they appear in everything from indigenous shamanism, religious framing, modern humanist and Greek classical cultures. It's like meditation. You know, meditation is just a technique. Yeah? It's a way of approaching consciousness. It has measurable, repeatable, scientifically testable and real effects on the world for the individual, and, as I was saying earlier, possibly for 3 generations down the line. So here's a technique. Now, I would probably, as a magician, as an occultist, I would say, oh, well, I'm going to put that in the Venn diagram of things that are part of the occult tradition. Other people have different opinions. But nevertheless, the technique, the approach to changing awareness using an imaginative process, and the process in this instance is just sitting down, shutting up and listening to your breath and being noticing what your attention does. That technique appears in many, many, many traditions, whether it's John Kabat-Zinn doing pain reduction stuff, working in the United States in a very modern medical context, and doing developing mindfulness-based cognitive therapy or mindfulness-based treatment models, or whether or not it's happening in some kind of Tibetan monastery with a bunch of guys with crazy hats on. It's the same. Yeah, the technique is the same. And magic is this kind of, um, the kind of the strange uncle that we don't talk about to all of those things. So it has a relationship with religion. It has a relationship with science. If you look at people like Isaac Newton's fascinated by things like alchemy and so on. You know, we talk about people like sort of Bacon and Bruno and all of these characters. You know, Paracelsus. All of these people are magician. You know, and they're the founding figures of this discourse. And actually, science and magic are by no means oppositional at all, because magic is about kind of experimentation, technique, and approach. It's different from science in as much as it deliberately roots itself in the imaginal, subjective world. Yeah.
Okay.
So it says this is our territory. This is not about getting at some kind of Popperian, intrasubjective form of reality. This is about imagination and utilizing the territory of the imagination to explore what might be possible as humans. And there are many ways we can think of this. We can think of this in a purely down the line psychology way, that what magic is it's at one level, it's a repertoire of techniques for programming the self, you know, gratitude prayers. That's a you know, or every day in every way I'm getting better and better, self-affirmations that are on, you know, your PC when you turn it on in the morning, whatever. There are other techniques that look much more spooky magic, which are, we're going to create an imaginal territory by drawing a circle on the floor. We'll do it in something spooky, like I don't know, you know, salt in a black room, and we will do this in order to try and summon up various kind of imaginal structures where we place the reality of those imaginal structures. Maybe that outside of the ritual chamber, we say these are archetypes, or these are just metaphors that we're using. And inside the ritual system, we might say these are spirits and gods that I'm communicating with. In this way that if you go and see a film and you spend your time going, oh no, this is just patches of light and shade on a screen with noises. It's like, yeah, but unless you engage with it as a movie, as a real story, you ain't going to get nothing from it. And magic is like that. Magic is the same way that when you go and see a film and you see people talking and the words come out of their mouths, the words don't come out of their mouths, they come out of the speakers either side of the room. Your imagination puts them in their mouths. And so that's what magic works with. It works with your ability to do stuff like that. And it says, okay, given the fact that that's how it works, and given the fact that actually that's how a lot of culture works, you know, money is imaginary, religion is imaginary, all these imaginary borders are imaginary, all these are imaginal structures. You know, one might, you know, so let's work with the malleability of this and explore that. And magic attempts to do that through a whole variety of different means. And it has a, you know, like every story, it has a history, and it has lineage, and it has people who are significant figures in it, and, you know, different and sometimes competing ideas about it. But that's I guess how I think about it. Did that help?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, but to make sure I'm getting this, are there like routines outside of meditation, or I know you're big into yoga as well, that you could possibly count as a form of magic that you use in daily use?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll give you an example just from recent experience, because I always like kind of coherent examples. So I have recently been working with a space which I'm using to do psychedelic therapeutic work. And that's a physical space that I've been, you know, painting and doing all these things to making beautiful and so on. And one of the things that I did as part of my preparation of that space was I did a ritual which is called the Gnostic Pentagram Ritual. So this is a ritual, a ceremony. It's a very short thing. It's about 15 minutes long.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a ceremony which I learned as part of becoming involved in a chaos magic group. I don't know, like 15 years ago, something like this. And for some reason, I felt like, oh, that's actually the kind of I want to do that practice here. It's like, okay, so firstly, magic is about listening. It's about listening to the unconscious and listening to the kind of the stuff that dreams normally tell us and going, oh, this feels like it's welling up, right? And then the ritual itself is really straightforward. It's like a centering ritual, and it's about kind of banish. It's usually described as a banishing ritual, so you're getting rid of things that are in the way, just in the same way that when you physically tidy your house. And it's also then inviting in this kind of, let's call it good energy, just to use a really, really annoying phrase that means nothing in the context of the way the word energy is typically used in scientific terms.
Mm-hmm.
But we understand what it means, don't we? We understand. So we're inviting in this kind of good energy into the space. And what it looks like pragmatically is it looks like me waving my arms around and making some vowel sounds. Yeah, that's what the mechanics of it is.
Okay.
So and then there's a whole bunch of like imaginal stuff that sort of sits behind that and so on. So that's like a ceremony, like a really simple ceremony, which I've used recently. So there are practices like that, and then there are things that are much more specific to the time, the place, the group, the environment, and other practices like divination and other elements, if you like, to the kind of the story of magical practice.
Divination, is that like tarot carding reading and
Yeah,
stuff, or
yeah, yeah, yeah. So again, divination. I mean, that's divination. I think is a great example of how to explore this territory of magic. So for me, I do tarot card readings with people, and I think of divination as this is primarily an opportunity for the person who's coming for the reading to explore where they are at the moment through having a series of symbols in front of them, basically randomly picked symbols. Random, assuming there are things in the universe that are random. That's another story.
sure?
So we have these pictures that come out, and then between us, what we do is it's like almost like a counselling opportunity. But because you have a set of symbols between you, it's much easier to talk about a set of symbols and then relate them back to your story than it is to talk about your story directly. It's less threatening. And also because it's a slightly weird environment, you're coming and having your tarot cards read. People open up and say things that they often wouldn't say under other circumstances. It has a confessional space. What also happens in my experience is that very occasionally, and say very occasionally, actually, it's I don't like put numbers on this, but one phenomenon that I have noticed is sometimes my practice is I put down 3 cards and after the person's shuffled the deck, and I'll say, well, these are the cards I might expect to see if the story was kind of like this. And often that's just like that's enough of an intro for the conversation to emerge and the person to have this opportunity. And occasionally I put down the 3 cards and I say, well, this is the kind of thing that I would expect to see. I don't know, if a duplicitous man had stolen a big load of money from you recently and you were really distressed by this. And the person
Okay.
goes, oh my God, how did you know? And I say, I have no idea. That's why we call it magic. None of us know. None of us know. But we do know that sometimes that happens. Now, whether that is luck, whether or not that's like some weird synchronistic, I mean, I have no idea how it works. That's why I just kind of put a bracket around it and say I call it magic because I don't understand it. It is a mystery.
Mhm.
Yeah, but I do know that if I set up the right environment, sometimes, and interestingly, the more I do tarot card readings, the better I get. So if I've done them for like a week, I'm getting quite a lot of these, what parapsychologists will call a hit, in the last couple of
Okay.
days. So you seem to get sort of better at it. Um, uh, and so that's kind of, that's a nice example of this kind of magic sits at this slippery interface. Yes, at one level, this is just counseling. This is just like a weird confessional environment where the person can talk about their problems, and you know, you can maybe they can get some insight, whether that's from you or just talking about it aloud. But occasionally, there'll be what parapsychologists would call a hit, and often sometimes there are things that are sort of slightly between those two imagined extremes. That's tarot card reading. So um, and that I think is a good example of this kind of where these things sort of mesh together. So it's it's partly this sort of mythological sort of activity that you're being the person who can tell the future. I say, look, if I could tell the future one-to-one mapping, I'd have 6 magic numbers by now, and I'd be like, rich. I'd have won the lottery, and it would all be fine. Um, uh,
So it's
but
not quite
actually,
as easy as just manifesting something or just throwing it
you know,
out.
although when I say that, I say I would only be doing what I really love doing, and actually, to be honest, I really love doing things like tarot card readings for people. So the metaphor doesn't really work, but nevertheless, it's not about that. But occasionally there will be these moments which, to me, I would read that as a kind of parapsychological phenomena, if I want to be, think of it like those terms. And I've no idea how it works. Or indeed, if it works, whether or not I just have some sort of strange, random statistical thing where I, as an individual, get this phenomena happens to me, and there's nothing at all to do. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I've no idea. No idea.
It seems like to me that must be some element of synchronicity in all of this.
But synchronicity is just another kind of peg word for we don't know what this is.
Yeah.
And to be honest, that's not surprising. Here are my hands. I don't know how these work. I have no idea. I know I've got a legend about them, about how the atoms came from ancient dead stars billions of years ago. But I don't know. I don't know how the consciousness works. That's looking at I don't know how any of it works really. I've got words to describe things, and those sometimes help with the relationship with stuff.
Sure.
That's cool.
Hmm.
But yeah, synchronicity, magic, same,
You
same.
you're from the southwest coast, are you?
That's where I'm living now. Yeah, I'm living in southwest England. Yeah, down in Devon.
Okay, where's home originally, Julian? Don't mind me asking.
Home originally is not far north of London, over on the eastern side of the island.
Okay. What do you think that like any of where you live now is influencing the kind of things that you're into? Because I had an aunt and my grandmother were bang into all this when I was growing up, and they were living down in Lyme Regis, in the Dorset area, and I felt like everyone down there was a little bit more orientated toward the mystical, if you don't mind me saying. I felt like that was a part of England that is probably a little bit more embedded in some of this,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know.
yeah. I don't know. Everywhere has its own magic. Everywhere. London, William Blake would have told you that London has its own magic. For me, when I was growing up, particularly not far from London, the West Country was this kind of mythical realm. I remember watching many years ago on the telly Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and there's a bit where Willow goes bad, and then she goes to a rehabilitation with a coven of witches that are in Devon, and you can see
Yeah,
this like
yeah, yeah,
vision of like this kind of archetypal sort of British kind of concept, which is kind of quite charming and lovely. And there is bits of it like that. I mean, I do work at a place called St Nectan's Glen. We have like this magical waterfall that falls down into this valley, and it's near Tintagel, where King Arthur was born,
yeah,
and Merlin
yeah.
Tables. And just up the road is the Boscastle Witchcraft Museum. Yeah, man, it's hilarious and funny. It's like Tintagel's like Hobbiton on sea. It's brilliant. Glastonbury. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
what a hilarious and entertaining thing. But there's magic everywhere. There's magic in the fact that your hands are these astonishing things made from ancient dead stars. You know,
Sure,
you
yeah, it's incredible.
know,
Should be enough to keep you going, in my opinion. That sort of fact
yeah.
alone, really. So last thing, I wanted to ask you about who were the magicians of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and what is belladonna?
Okay, so belladonna means beautiful woman, and it's the name of the nightshade. So it's one of the Solanaceae plants, one of that whole family of scary potato drugs. So that's things like and that whole family of sort of uh, alkaloids which were traditionally used, or not traditionally used. There are stories of them being used by witches, in terms of the mandrake and similar kind of species of plants. Who are the So the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn is a fin de siècle British magical order. It had a really interesting mixture, including men and women, so it wasn't a Masonic organization in the true sense of the term. And it was a place where lots and lots of the kind of magicians worked, who ended up giving rise to kind of contemporary Western magical culture. So you're talking about the poet W.B. Yeats, you're talking about people like Aleister Crowley, you're talking about people like Gregor Mathis, and the designer of the classic tarot cards, Pamela Coleman Smith. You're talking about people like Florence Farr and Maud Gonne, the Irish Home Rule
Wow.
political activist. I mean, there's a whole bunch of really interesting people. If you want to read about the women, there's a really good book by Mary Greer, I think it is, called Women of the Golden Dawn, which is definitely worth reading. And they were one of those organizations at the cutting edge of a lot of kind of experimental religion, I suppose you call it, or spirituality, and autonomous spirituality. And one of the things they did was use mescaline, and hash. So that was, although not a foreground part of their story, it was in the mix, and certainly it fed particularly into the work of Aleister Crowley and some of the other members of the group too.
Just for my own knowledge, is mescaline the same in the San Pedro cactus as it is in the peyote, or is that something completely different?
No, it's the same. There are, as I understand it, differences in the kind of the other alkaloids that are present, but it's basically the same stuff. So it's a phenethylamine, same family as like MDMA, which obviously has kind of organic roots as well, although it's a substance that's only really made by humans, as far as we know. So yeah, it's the same material. So mescaline comes into European culture quite directly in the end of the 19th century, and it's used by a guy called Havelock Ellis, who's an early kind of sexologist and explorer of these things, and he passes it down the line and eventually ends up with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So what I'm kind of talking about at occulture, one of the things I'll be talking about is just kind of fleshing out this idea of occultists, magicians, people who identify in this way. They are some of the people who've actually been involved in kind of exploring ways to hold these spaces. So Aleister Crowley in particular became very interested in how you could create what these days we would call psychedelic ritual. So he was kind of exploring that. The Golden Dawn in their various ways were doing other practices which were part of that. That story goes into kind of contemporary witchcraft and so on. There's a whole history behind it. But yeah, so you're talking about late 19th century, early 20th century people in Europe for the first time, pretty much since the doors to the Temple at Eleusis closed in 400 AD, having access to psychedelics and using these things and realizing that, wow, there's a whole other way of cognizing the world, which can be at the very least entertaining and at the most deeply challenging and also profoundly healing and ecstatic. So it's a big moment in history, and I just want to talk about that a little bit.
Is Datura Jimson weed in the USA?
Yeah. So another member of the same kind of family of plants, basically. So there's things like the nightshade,
Okay.
and similar kind of atropine style alkaloids. So often talked about as deliriants rather than psychedelics. I'm have little practice with these things, so I can't speak authoritatively about them at all. I know that people have lots of different relationships with them, some of which are very good and some of which are very problematic. So it's a thing. They're very powerful, certainly.
Sure. And is Datura, is it also a native plant to anywhere in the UK?
It certainly grows in places like India and was definitely being cultivated in Britain by I'm pretty sure by the kind of the 18th century, sort of fairly early on. It was used as a medication for things like asthma, and it had various kind of so it's a powerful medicine. It's a powerful plant. You can use it for all sorts of purposes. Certainly by the time the Victorians were knocking around, they were great fans of it. They quite liked big blooms of datura growing, and there are stories that ladies would sort of just gently tap the flower to get tiny amounts of the pollen from the flower, because the whole thing is it's a they're very powerful plants. Lots of the alkaloids are very kind of active throughout the whole of the plant. So yeah, and they also have these kind of associations with sort of witchcraft, sorcery, all that kind of stuff as well.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. Is it any relation to Colombia's devil breath? Have you heard of this plant?
Oh, I don't know.
No, because I've seen it. I think I saw Hamilton Morrison talking about it once, from the Vice chemist, who was saying that it was a delirium-inducing truth serum. Anyway,
That sounds very
man,
familiar.
thank you so much for this evening. This has been razor sharp for me in many ways, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you speak next week. I think you're speaking at 4:30 on Sunday, I believe.
Something like that. Yeah. Everyone will be just like full of food and won't care by then. They'll just be sleeping, which is cool by me, But it'd be I'm really looking forward to it. Our culture looks like an amazing lineup of people. It's not. I think this is the first conference they run. I hope it's a fantastic success and it leads to many other things. But I'm certainly looking forward really kind of connecting with some of that kind of European
Mm.
occulture, less familiar with, someone who's kind of locked into English. Be really interesting to kind of connect with that, and always nice to travel to Berlin.
Yeah,
Always.
absolutely. And will you be every night of the culture from Friday to Sunday, or?
Yeah, I'm gonna be there for the opening. I want to see Ferber. I want to see those guys
Yeah,
with crazy
yeah,
hats with the growling. It's going to be
yeah,
brilliant.
yeah. And of course, your partner is also speaking there, right?
Yeah. So yeah, Nikki Weird will be there. She's going to be speaking on Friday, I think it is, and yeah, so she's going to be doing stuff about uh, being a magician, and as we looking at death and how we approach death and understanding that. So yeah, doing that kind of thing.
Where can people find you, Julian, if they want to see more of your work?
Easiest place is there's a place online, which is the blog of Baphomet. So the blog of Baphomet.com. And it's been going for years. So if you just stick it into Google, you'll find it. And there's a lot of essays and things on there. You'll also find kind of links to some of the work, more detail about the work I do and the retreats and workshops and publications and marketing and blah. But hopefully there'll be things in there that people find interesting. There's loads and loads and loads of articles and things from me and from a lot of other people. So there's a lot of interesting content to find there. And yeah, if people are kind of old school and want to find me on Facebook, that's cool as well. As long as their profile picture doesn't look too crazy, I'll probably, be their friend. I'm quite, yeah, I like collaborating and working with other people. Most of the people that I encounter are fantastic and lovely. So yeah, relatively easy to find. So the blog of Baphomet.com, and wandering around on Facebook, I guess, is the thing. Oh, and Instagram as well. Yeah.
You're active on Instagram, are you?
I am actively on Instagram. Instagram is great because you're just like, here's a cool picture. Brilliant.
Yeah,
I love
yeah.
it.
It's a good
Brilliant.
community. And of course, I will get fired into your book, Getting Higher. I'm looking forward to that. And I hope to connect with you after that too. Julian, thank you so much. Julian Vayne, honestly, it's been a pleasure. And I really hope to meet you in person next week. And I'm probably in
Yeah.
for a real treat and some surprise on some of this stuff. Hey, good night.
Thank you very much for inviting me on. Really appreciate it,
No,
Johnny.
thank you.
Take it
Ciao,
easy.
Julian. Good night.
Bye.